And there seems to be some extra electromagnetic effects where those 4 planets start to play in on themselves as everything, as the sun declines in its activity, those 4 start to coalesce in their own magnetic field, and then the Earth's sandwiched in the middle there, and you have looping toroid waves on top of that. I mean, there's a lot of ifs out there, and we're about to live a lot of science is going to go light years ahead on understanding our solar system, the sun, the cycles, and how different magnetic fields can form an inner loop on outer planets here in these next 10 years. We'll probably learn more about science with the instrumentation we have in these next 10 years than we did in the last 5,000.
I'm Jeff Nyquist. This is the J.R. Nyquist podcast, and with me is David Dubine. He is the guy that does the mini ice age conversations, global cooling, grand solar minimum, all things about this science, about the changes in the weather and other things that are coming. And I'm trained as a political science, David. Welcome to the show.
Appreciate you having me on, because what I see in the future of repeating cycles of solar activity that are going to reduce food production and crash the economy as disposable income is fed into the food monster and the food economy. We kind of dovetail through history at these apexes and declines of civilization and society, but what is it all about, and what really causes the triggers that make a society collapse or change the government, or what really, I should say it's more about the emotive feelings through history of why do people get angry where they want change in systems, governments, economy, etc., and what makes them happy where they don't want action, where they're completely complacent and happy. Well, if you're not eating, I think that's one of the things that would make you not happy. So if you understand it's a 400-year cycle and we're here again right now, it makes sense, a lot of things happening in the world. So yeah, I think we're going to have a great conversation, as we did when we talked the other day on the phone about, overlapping cycles of history, and maybe we can see around the corner here what's happening in our modern world.
Yeah, and of course, it's the food thing that is probably my biggest worry, because in political science, when people don't eat, there's revolutions, there's wars, large numbers of people migrate, they move. You got a lot of people think the fall of the Roman Empire was connected to this. You had the Bronze Age collapse. We don't know why the Sea Peoples moved, right, back there in the second millennium BC. We've got these cycles. You know a lot about what happened in China. We've got 2 straight summers of flooding in China. I heard a guy who is a military debriefer at the Pentagon talk about what he's allowed to talk about was that last year China raised less than 50% of the food it needed for domestic consumption, a shortfall for 750 million people in China not eating food from China, eating food either from a stockpile or from another country they've bought up on the world market. And I understand, is this true that now with the drought in the western states of the U.S. and the flooding in Europe and the freezes in Brazil, there is not the food that the Chinese bought last year on the world market is not going to be available after this harvest season? Is that true? It's
not. And just a quick synopsis on that. Record cold, 150-year cold in Brazil, Argentina, which wiped out an enormous amount of the sugar and the coffee on top of the corn and the soy you're referring to. So China always looks at as a secondary producer that will add into main buyers or sellers to China, them being the buyers, United States. And Australia's not doing too well. The lockdowns are real heavy there. Plus they had a lot of crop losses. EU's exports are down, I think, 10%. And, everywhere you look, and Russia's also cut their forecast about 3 million tons. So wherever you're looking, China's not going to have the food. And you know what they did last year, since you're referencing last year's floods, not this year's massive amount of crop losses, but last year's. Xi Jinping started 2 different campaigns. One was called the Clean Plate Campaign, where it was almost a sin for you to leave any food on your plate. And at the same time, in conjunction with that, you were only allowed to order 1 plate of food per person in a restaurant. Now, if you know anything about Chinese culture, when you go to a restaurant, there's 4 people, you order 8 plates of food, you overorder. So to bring that back in, 1 plate, 1 person, that was another campaign. But now the amount of food has shrunken in the portions, and they're trying to encourage people to move to more of a vegetarian diet away from the meat because of the pork reductions. So the new kids have a slang for this. They call it chewing grass. The chewing grass campaign. That's a new slang in China for the young kids. They're like, oh, we love chewing grass. They're being all facetious about it. But where is China going to get the food this year? And another little quick factoid, United States lost about 70% of the wheat that they normally grow this year as a country. So knowing that it's just physically not there to buy, I don't care how much money you have, unless you're going to strip it out of the mouths of the country that's producing it, it's just simply not there on the market anymore. So, geopolitically, where does that leave us?
Yeah,
if they need food to feed people, they need distraction because people will be hungry. That's the only way, I think, in just a simplistic way.
Yeah, and this is the burning question. We saw the release of COVID. It was, and here they released it about really coincidentally when this grand solar minimum that's making the weather changes began. My question to you, do you think the Chinese government knows that the food supply is in trouble? They see this grand solar minimum coming, that we're only at the beginning of the loss of crops here. We've got almost 8 billion people on the planet, and we're pretty soon. Is this just the beginning? Is it going to get worse? Where are we headed? And do you think the Chinese have known about this, and that that attempt to release and to reduce the world's population is a solution maybe?
That's a terrible solution and a wrong mind think to go down that road when there's so much abundance that has been sort of pulled back in technology for different energy production devices. If we move to indoor vertical agriculture, and there's an entire new industry that spurs out of this where we can start to use, think about how much square footage or square meters there are in a disused office building because everybody's working from home, or how many square meters are in a parking garage that people aren't utilizing because they're not driving to work. Think about retrofitting all these square meters into square miles of food production. That's going to be ultra high tech and up to highest yields. That's one direction to go down and think. There is a solution there, and we could implement that. It'd be kind of a new, and I hate to use that word Green Deal, but more of a New Deal type of thing in America where they did all the roads, et cetera. But for indoor vertical ag and different food production and different species in different latitudes that could still grow and produce enough food for the world. But that is a capital B. But nothing has been done. None of these conversations even exist except for persons like yourself. And I'm so thankful that you're willing to entertain the idea and even talk about this grand solar minimum and the ramifications for our society. The way it looks is what is grown is what you get. And I just don't know how they're going to be able to feed the global populace. Now, that is just such a rude and non-human solution to depopulate at least a quarter of the world right now, just to match the declines in what can be produced in the fields. When you start to go to that type of level, through history, there's names for these types of entities. That's a non-human, in my personal opinion, solution for a human problem. But yeah, you got to look at the timing on it. It is incredibly strange, the timing. 2020, and it's the onset of the first crop losses globally where they really dented in. Why did food prices go up 30, 40, 50? And it will be doubling by the end of the year. It's ongoing because there's a lag behind on. There's already still some what they call stores in the silos. Carryover stocks is the proper name for that. There's still tonnage in the silos from last year or the prior 2 years. We're eating into that gargantuan dig into it with we're not just nibbling into it. They're taking a 1,000-pound monster, diving into it, eating it every day, to make it appear as if everything's still balanced. But as you see, with rising food prices and what's being thrown at us weather-wise at the moment, it's going to continue to amplify. This grand solar minimum is going to continue to amplify. The Chinese have the best climatic records of any culture outside of, say, some of the Arabic cultures that have held their trade routes. Think about the frankincense route going up through Saudi Arabia from Oman, and the whole Aksum culture, which is Ethiopia as we know it now. And the trade routes going through Central Africa all the way over to Mauritania, the country we know now. But that was more of a regional, sort of a Middle East type of thing. But the Chinese have been sailing along the coast, sending the Silk Road through, and they kept very detailed records about what was happening clear to the far west of Africa when something completely different was happening in Far East in Asia, say the East Coast of where Shanghai would be now. They compiled all these records and laid them on top of each other to get a very good detail of about 4,000 years of exploration, of how something had monster rains or record rains in the desert over there would signal whatever it is, the Rubik's Cube of combinations of possible weather and climate shifting on cycles, not human input. But they had that mapped out for 4,000 years. So absolutely, unequivocally, 0% chance they do not know what is coming. They know what's coming, and they're basing and moving every chessboard piece around and setting up the society for this very event. The entire way that China's political maneuvering is happening, it's for continuity of their government to survive through one of these grand solar minimums, right along with Russia, getting ready with more cold weather gear, more cold weather vehicles, cold weather training, the clothing in their military's training. Everything's moving toward sort of a colder future for at least Russian military. I mean, there's a lot of people that are understanding what's going and they're pre-positioning themselves. You mentioned icebreakers in our previous call as an example.
Yeah, Russia's been laying down keels of icebreakers for at least several years. I saw I think it was almost 10 years ago, I watched Putin. I'm a Putin watcher. And he was in an interview and they asked him about global warming. And he said, I don't believe in global warming. I believe in global cooling. And he kind of gave that little creepy smile he gives whenever he tells the truth. But of course, he gives lip service to global warming. But at that moment, he was being very honest. And of course, the Russian scientists, the leading scientists, Abdusamatov, he's been talking more than a decade, but it's really come true in the last several years about a severe global cooling that he sees coming. And a country like Russia that is at such a northern latitude, in the last grand solar minimum, Napoleon lost the Grand Army in an early winter in Russia. Lost to horses. They froze. Their legs they got frostbite. Horses don't survive that. They ate the horses. The men were pulling the baggage train. France did not recover for the number of horses they lost for many years. And that was a period of starvation, even into the 19th century, being Scandinavian. I know that my ancestors on my mother's side of the family, many of them came to the United States because the last great famine where people starved in Europe, that was in Scandinavia from cold winters. And so it is a really serious thing when the temperature goes down, and you have more volcanic eruptions during grand solar minimums, and I should ask you why that is, but we do have it and we had this tremendous eruption. I think it was in 1815. I think they called it the year without a summer, because the ash from that volcanic eruption, you had rivers and lakes freezing in the United States in July that year. Maybe you could tell us a little about that and about the volcanic eruption dimension to what we're facing. Is there increased volcanic and earthquake activity during a solar minimum, a grand solar minimum?
There is, and I think that's what worries people more than armies moving around the world at the moment, because it doesn't matter where your army might be stationed, if you get another Tambora eruption coming off as it did. And by the way, that same exact volcano has sent off 50,000-foot ash emissions just about 2 years ago. It's come to life again right there. It's in Indonesia. It's right on the equatorial band. Now to swing back now, this is how those volcanoes tie in. You were talking about Dr. Abdusamatov he's the director at the Pulkovo Observatory in Russia, coming out with approval, obviously, of the Russian government to put out these forecasts. He's got an amazing chart showing you when we're entering in this grand solar minimum, approximately 2 solar cycles, how long it will last. He understands the temperature drops and the effects on the planet, but at the same time, the way the sun, when it steps down in its activity, our Earth steps down too, to match the electromagnetic charge on it. And if one that's much larger steps down, it will affect the other one and it will equalize its charge, because nothing goes to zero. There's a lot of discharge as well in the Earth's electric circuit, where you'll see ground to sky lightning, you'll see a lot more aurora. There's these blue jets are much more pronounced and seen, these blue electrical emanations from the tops of hurricanes, or where they're most well seen. But the elves and these electric sprites, which are the red spectrum of the electrical discharges, They almost look like something off a canyon wall that you would see, but they're becoming much more pronounced. So give you an example, in the 1960s and 50s, these things were thought of just myth and legend, but now they stay visible in glow mode for 2 seconds after the lightning strike's finished. And it's incredible the way that they waft through the skies and move. So I would consider them elves dancing in the sky 2,000 years ago if I was going to explain it to you, except for understanding it's an electrical discharge holding state in a plasma form for a little bit of time longer in the skies. So if the Earth's crust is going to change in electrical holding charge and the differential between where it needs to go and where it is now, it's got to let off some of that. And the way it would do it is earthquakes and volcanoes. Now they find this correlation's nearly 100%. It's not exactly, but it's in the high 90s of grand solar minimums and increases in volcanic eruptions and large magnitude earthquakes. Like that Tambora eruption, the year without a summer, the way it works now, wherever you are in our world on the latitudes, if you have an equatorial eruption, those are the most dangerous because when the ash comes out, it gets caught in the cloud cells that pull further north. Mm-hmm. There's different cloud cells on the planet. The Hadley cell is probably the most famous that people would know. Mm-hmm. From 0 degree latitude to 30 degrees latitude is that first cell going north, but an equatorial eruption, it'll grab the ash and take it to from 0 degrees to 30 degrees south. So the ash starts spinning north and south across the planet. But if you get a massive eruption, like they did Mount St. Helens, for example, Pinatubo, for example, over in the Philippines, those will stray and they'll stay in their bands of latitude, but they'll only transit up 1 or 2 cloud cells from 30 degrees to 60 degree or 60 degree up to the North Pole. And that's as far as it goes. It doesn't recirculate and find its way going reversal down to the equator. It's just where the volcanic is in that churning of the atmosphere from north to south or south down to the South Pole is where it stays. Equatorial eruptions go through all the cloud cells, both north and south. And that's how you get that massive global cooling from one single eruption, because it's going everywhere evenly across the planet versus being locked in at 50 degrees north latitude where it spins up there. There's regional cooling, and then further up it affects that for a year or two. But further south, there's no difference.
And that eruption in 106 years ago, that was the biggest, I think, eruption in recorded history, wasn't it? That we know of. Is that right?
Well, there's been larger, Lake Toba is another one. That was 70,000 years ago. And apparently it was year without a summer for like 14, 15 years.
Of course, we don't have, the first history was written by Herodotus. He was born around 500 BC. So when you talk about 70,000 years ago, we only know that's geologic history, but written history only goes back 2,500 years. We don't even know we barely scratch the surface on what the Earth can do while we're on it. I mean, this eruption 106 years ago was maybe a firecracker compared to what might happen, right?
Well, it was 206. Yeah, I'll take it back. Those are
206 years ago.
So let me add to that.
Yeah.
There's a period of history called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Mm-hmm. And the onset was approximately 535 AD. Now, that's kind of not an exact number, but an agreed on number amongst many people who research the volcanic effects of declining societies at that point. Mm-hmm. So 535 AD, there were 3 major eruptions that, again, blocked out sun and had massive effects. And there are even written accounts on how the air seemed to be poisoned in Rome and across Greece, where people were having sort of acidic lung diseases where almost sulfuric acid was building in and people would just suffocate and their lungs would collapse in on them. So at least one that could be pinpointed to Iceland at the time, at least one was pinpointed to Central America at that time. And the third is an unknown still, but they think it was an equatorial. Again, there's a lot of, missing pieces going back that far in terms of what was destroyed after 500 years of conquest. I mean, if we could have kept every single culture's records intact on what happened instead of destroying most of it during the 500 years of pillaging that our world experienced, we'd probably have a much better idea, unless that information was privy to the few. But there's a lot of lost history, and trying to piece it together through geologic record and ice core data and lake core drilling sediments and pollen count and these sort of things, you get a pretty good picture, but it's better to have a historical account of somebody with two eyes looking up saying, wait, this happened, just like you're referring to.
Yeah, when the fall of the Roman Empire, we don't even know all the combinations of things. But yes, some of these things, like smoky sky, not being able to see the sun or the sun discolored. And then there was another thing is that there's the idea that there are more plagues when these things happen as well. Have you heard this?
I have, and there's a direct train of thought that goes with that. With a weakened magnetosphere or magnetic shielding around our planet gets much weaker, so cosmic debris can penetrate further into the atmosphere. So something that would have burned up, several dozens of miles above us can now penetrate in or even make ground impact or come incredibly low into the atmosphere. And the train of thought is during times of incredibly low solar activity, not the 11-year cycle, not the grand solar minimum cycles, interlooped with that even larger cycles, the bacteria or virus or whatever it is that's on the space debris rocks actually makes it to the ground and brings in something that hasn't been on the planet before. And then we get a variant of that moving forward. So it does seem that when cometary debris, cometary tails brush the planet, there's a lot of legends and stories about this, whenever these types of space events happen, and you get a meteor shower with 10,000 meteors per hour coming through, people know there's going to be sickness on top of that because something has entered our atmosphere and the ground and the water that was previously not here. Now, again, you need to come back to written records on that. Every time they see the skies falling, literally, raining tears off of the heavens, there's plagues after that. And why is that?
Yeah.
And you have to put the correlation together, and a lot of people have.
Now, Svensmark's work is interesting because he focuses in on the collapse of the sun's electromagnetic field. And of course, every 11 years or give or take, the regular solar cycle, the sun's electromagnetic field collapses, reverses, and regenerates. But during a grand solar minimum, it doesn't really fully regenerate. And that electromagnetic field is protecting the Earth and the whole solar system from muons or cosmic rays. And Svensmark's theory is that one of the things when in a grand solar minimum happens is that these rays strike the ocean and muons create clouds. And when more of them reach the oceans, we get more clouds, and maybe it also creates more mutations in bacteria and viruses, who knows. But it creates more clouds, it creates a lot more rain. We see the flooding in China. We do see drought somewhere else, but over the planet overall, you have more cloud cover, which means more of the sun's light is reflected back in the upper atmosphere. And so there's a general cooling that takes place. You can even have a theory of ice ages based on this, because if you get more and more clouds built up, you're going to get more and more snow, maybe more snow that can be melted during the summer. The planet is cooling. You get this kind of gradual icebox effect. Is that kind of your understanding of how ice ages get started?
The understanding of ice ages up to this point is the primer field on the sun collapses where it goes into a lower state of activity, which then everything that in terms of how our planetary systems is so far beyond it, biblical would be a light version of what would happen at that point. Mm-hmm. If the sun's not that strong where it actually changes color and dims down to the point of, there has been references of that, but that's the primer field on the sun collapsing down in on itself. But for some reason, it magically restarts. And, you go through these ebbs and flows of incredible low solar activity where primer fields have collapsed for 90,000 years, and then suddenly it turns itself back on, comes into a really active state again, and then everything else on the planet would follow in sync with that. So the triggers for the ice ages coming in so far are a combination of what you're talking about, but that's a secondary effect. The single first effect would be a primer field collapse, the stoppage of the solar wind, the magnetosphere collapsing, and then the jet streams, cloud cells going out, and like you say, the cosmic rays coming in and creating new cloud layers, but then the volcanic emissions would layer on top of that, so you would get a runaway feedback loop for some time until the magnetic current sheath strengthened it and it turned everything back on electromagnetically to get tension in the system again. So what is the feedback loop that's really going to drive it this time? we're starting to see a couple of things. Now, Svensmark's work's quite interesting. If you follow Heinrich Svensmark, when he came up with the ideas of cosmic rays creating cloud layers, he lost his funding. He lost his position at the university. They had to build their own laboratory to carry out the experiments. And even when they built their own laboratory, carried out their own experiments, when they submitted for publication, they wouldn't take it until CERN backed it up and said, oh, yes, by the way, yeah, all that research Svensmark did, when CERN came on, they're like, oh, yeah, back. And then suddenly like, oh, Svensmark, Heinrich, you're our best buddy. Come back in our club. And he's like, no. You guys tried to ruin me, suppress all the information about the influx and impact of cosmic rays. And just for an outlier there, people who like to read, Robert Felix, who just recently passed away, had written a book, Not by Fire, but by Ice, which talks about your onset and the coming in and coming out of glaciation periods, which is still, I mean, really, it's kind of an unknown, but there's better science to understand it now. But he also wrote a second book, Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps.
Now, you're talking about magnetic reversal of the Earth's electromagnetic field now, right?
Yeah, correct. But at the same time, when the primer field on the sun collapses and there's an enormous, when I say enormous, we're talking about hundreds of times more cosmic rays coming in, or thousands of times more than now. There's instant jumps in species. And that's what Robert's book was around, was following these, magnetic reversals of the Earth's magnetic field itself, north to south, south to north, or wandering in different positions. And the way that suddenly in the fossil record, things would just appear out of nowhere. And he was trying to put these together over millions of years. And that was his last peg of research, was specifically on that correlation and connection between cosmic ray density of just so far off the charts, we would know, our instrumentation probably wouldn't be able to measure it. It would be that density of the cosmic rays, but still the effects on the planet. And, with the sun, the 11-year cycle, that just means it reversed, but then it takes another 11 years to reverse it back to where it began 22 years prior. So if it's a north-south reversal, but then it's going to reverse itself back again, so it's back to the same. So it's a round trip of 22 years to do one complete north to south, south to north, to bring those positions back in parallel.
And does the polarity of the sun's electromagnetic field matter to the Earth?
Yes, they find that weather patterns do change, and traders trade on this. And, La Niñas and El Niños are built into the whole mix here of when the sun's magnetic field reverses itself. Well, we get La Niñas, and then when it reverses back, we get El Niños. And they're grain traders and commodities traders are all over these cycles. So if you think it's some woo-woo that Jeff and I are talking about, people make their entire living trading commodities based on what the cycles of the sun are doing to the Pacific Ocean temperatures or the Indian Ocean temperatures, and how that then will twist weather patterns to put more precipitation, cooler spring, warmer summer, drought here. It's a science. They've already built it out for 100 plus years. They already know where it's going to move, and they bet on grain commodities based on the cycle and what it does in heating or cooling the Pacific Ocean.
Interesting. And of course, what was kind of scary when I read some of Zarkova's material, and she's in England. She was born in the Soviet Union, but she works in England. Very, very meticulous person, working with teams of other people, saying that more than one of these solar magnetic fields are going into collapse, and that this is more than something that happened in the last grand solar minimum that we had. We didn't have this number of fields collapsing at the same time. So the implication is something more serious is happening that we haven't experienced in modern times at all.
A once in a 2,000-year event.
Yeah.
Because, I will just add this in here. If you look at where the planets will be in their orbits, what we're going to see in October of 2024 is the exact same orbits that we saw in 79 AD. Now, a lot of people know Vesuvius, obviously, is the most famous volcanic eruption then. But if you have any kind of software like Solar System Scope or JPL or there's a lot of free softwares out there that do planetary geometry or where the planets sit in their orbits. I would highly, highly encourage you to go out to October 2024. And if the software is strong enough, reverse it back to 79 AD or right around that 2,000-year mark, and you'll see how they match up in a square. And there seems to be some extra electromagnetic effects where those 4 planets start to play in on themselves as everything, as the sun declines in its activity, those 4 start to coalesce in their own magnetic field, and then the Earth's sandwiched in the middle there, and you have looping toroid waves on top of that. I mean, there's a lot of ifs out there, and we're about to live a lot of science is going to go light years ahead on understanding our solar system, the sun, the cycles, and how different magnetic fields can form and interloop on outer planets here in these next 10 years. We'll probably learn more about science with the instrumentation we have in these next 10 years than we did in the last 5,000.